Hello friends. I am glad you are here tonight, or perhaps today, depending on where you are. Before we begin, I have a little question for you. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I always find it fascinating to imagine people in different corners of the world, in different hours of their day, all gathering together for the same story. Maybe it is evening and you are already lying in bed, ready to drift into calm sleep. Maybe it is the middle of the afternoon, and you are simply curious to hear a tale that will carry you far away into another age. Wherever you are, thank you for joining me. Tonight, we will step quietly into the shadows and candlelight of the medieval world, and we will discover what it might have felt like to live not as a peasant, not as a wandering monk, not as a soldier, but as someone wealthy. Someone for whom life was wrapped in luxury, privilege, and also, perhaps, unexpected burdens. It is easy to imagine that being rich in the Middle Ages must have been only comfort, endless feasts, and soft beds. But the reality was more complicated. Wealth in that time meant heavy responsibility, intricate rules of honor, and a daily rhythm shaped not just by gold and silver, but by the customs of a society that prized hierarchy above all else. Tonight, I will take you by the hand, and together we will walk through a story that stretches across the great halls of castles, through candlelit chambers, across markets full of spices and silks, and even into the quieter corners of gardens where lords and ladies whispered secrets. Our story begins with a man named Robert de Vaimont. Robert was born into wealth, though he was not always certain whether that was a blessing or a burden. His father had been a baron, a loyal vassal to the king, and the family's land stretched across rolling green fields, dotted with villages where peasants bent their backs to till the soil. To be born into such a family meant that Robert never once had to wonder whether there would be bread on the table, or whether his roof would hold through the winter storms. But it also meant that from his earliest years, he was surrounded by expectations. As a child, Robert was dressed in fine wool imported from Flanders, his tiny shoes stitched from soft leather that most villagers could never hope to afford. While peasant children ran barefoot in the mud, Robert learned to sit upright at the long wooden table, to speak politely, and to know which knife was meant for cutting meat and which for fruit. From the age of 7, he was taught by a tutor who drilled him in Latin prayers, arithmetic, and the art of reading charters and documents. These were not merely lessons of the mind, they were lessons of power. Because to be rich in the Middle Ages was not only to own things, it was to command people, to direct their lives, and to carry on traditions that stretched back centuries. At the heart of Robert's childhood home stood the manor hall. Imagine a great rectangular room, its high beams blackened by years of smoke from the hearth. The fire was never allowed to go out, for it was the symbol of warmth and permanence. Along the walls hung tapestries depicting scenes from the Bible, but also scenes of hunting, deer brought down by noblemen with spears, or falcons swooping upon ducks. These were not just decorations, they were messages. Anyone who entered that hall would see clearly the wealth and status of the family. Meals in that hall were events in themselves. A typical dinner for Robert's family might begin with trenchers of bread, thick slices cut from yesterday's loaf, used as edible plates. Upon them were placed cuts of roasted venison, or a rich pottage flavored with onions, garlic, and perhaps, if the cook was lucky, a pinch of imported pepper. Spices were the jewels of the medieval kitchen, more costly than gold by weight. To have them upon your table was to send a signal to every guest. Here is a family of means, a family that can reach across oceans through merchants and trade. But being rich also meant constant performance. When Robert was still a boy, he noticed how his father never seemed fully at ease, even in his own hall. Each guest had to be greeted with just the right level of respect. Each meal had to be conducted according to ritual, with the correct order of courses, the precise placement of salt, the careful attention to who sat closest to the lord at the table. For in wealth, there was always the shadow of rivalry. Another lord, another baron, another wealthy knight might appear at the door, smiling politely but secretly measuring the richness of your plate against his own. Robert's mother, Lady Eleanor, bore her own share of this burden. She oversaw the household, ensuring that the servants polished the silver goblets until they gleamed, that the linen sheets were freshly laundered, that the tapestries did not gather too much dust. In her hands rested the honor of the family, for to run a sloppy household was to invite whispers, and whispers could wound more deeply than swords. Eleanor also managed the stores, casks of wine in the cellar, wheels of cheese aging in the cool chambers, sacks of grain to be portioned carefully so that the family might endure through winter without fear. Robert, as a boy, saw these things and thought them ordinary. It was only later, when he glimpsed the lives of the peasants, that he began to sense how extraordinary his existence truly was. For the peasants, bread was coarse and dark, meat was rare, and beds were nothing more than straw pallets. For Robert, even in childhood, there were feather-stuffed mattresses, woolen blankets, and meat at nearly every meal. And yet, wealth did not mean freedom. If anything, it bound Robert more tightly. When he turned 12, his life began to follow the carefully scripted path laid out for noble sons. Training in horsemanship, swordsmanship, and above all, the code of chivalry. He was told, again and again, that every gesture of his life must reflect the dignity of his station. He could not laugh too loudly, nor speak too casually, nor show too much weakness. To be rich in the Middle Ages was, in many ways, to live upon a stage always aware of the eyes that watched you. As Robert grew, he began to feel the pull of two worlds. The one inside his family's manor, glittering with tapestries, goblets, and feasts, and the one outside, where peasants lived lives of struggle and simplicity. And though he enjoyed the comforts of wealth, he also began to wonder, what was the true cost of such privilege? Robert's teenage years unfolded within walls of stone, yet he never felt entirely confined. The castle and its surrounding lands were his universe, vast and filled with endless lessons. He learned to ride a horse with the upright posture expected of a noble, his hands steady on the reins, his feet balanced in stirrups. A wealthy boy's horse was not merely a beast of burden. It was an extension of his identity, a living emblem of status. The animals themselves were costly to maintain, requiring skilled grooms, stables with clean straw, and a steady supply of oats. Peasants, of course, rarely rode at all. At best, they led plodding oxen to the fields, but for Robert, the horse became as natural as walking. Alongside horsemanship came the art of hunting. It was one of the great privileges of wealth in the Middle Ages, and Robert was instructed in it with great seriousness. The forests near his father's estate were reserved by law for noble hunting, guarded against trespass by peasants who might dare to snare a rabbit or fell a deer. Hunting was not only about meat, though the venison was prized. It was a pageant of skill and dominance, a ritual that displayed the Lord's command over nature. Robert learned to carry a hawk upon his wrist, its sharp eyes scanning the skies for prey. He listened to the horns echoing through the trees, calling hounds forward. He felt the rush of triumph when the animal was taken, though he also noticed, quietly, that every creature slain was one less beating heart in the forest. Meals became more elaborate as Robert grew older, and his seat at the long table shifted nearer to his father's place of honor. He began to notice the subtleties of dining, how guests judged the seasoning of the food, how they remarked on the texture of the bread, how a single spice could change the mood of the evening. One evening, the family served a dish flavored with cinnamon, carried by merchants across deserts and seas. A visiting knight raised his brows in admiration, and Robert realized that a sprinkling of spice could be more powerful than a show of arms. It was proof of wealth, of reach, of influence. He found himself fascinated by these subtleties, by the way a feast was not merely food, but theater. Outside the dining hall, other aspects of wealth revealed themselves. Robert's clothing grew more elaborate, with tunics dyed in shades of deep green and crimson, colors that peasants could not afford. His mother took care to embroider hems with threads of silver, subtle glints that caught the candlelight. Clothing was never only clothing. It was a language. Every stitch spoke of status. Even the smallest details, the length of a sleeve, the shape of a hood, could signal whether one was a lord, a merchant, or a simple laborer. Yet beneath all this grandeur, there was also unease. Robert began to overhear conversations between his father and his steward, words spoken in lowered tones about taxes, about harvests, about whether the peasants would be able to deliver enough grain to support the household through winter. Wealth did not mean escape from worry. It meant worry of a different kind. For every tapestry hanging in the hall, dozens of peasants labored in the fields. Their sweat and their hunger fed Robert's comfort. He felt the tension, though he could not fully express it. As adolescence turned to early manhood, Robert was drawn into the social rituals of noble life. There were feasts held not only within their own hall, but in neighboring castles. He saw how each family attempted to outdo the others, one boasting of a minstrel with a harp, another of a storyteller who could recite ancient legends for hours without pause. Wealthy life was not only about possessions but about spectacle, about how convincingly one could perform superiority. Robert, shy at first, gradually learned to smile at the right moments, to compliment the right dishes, to bow just low enough to show respect but not so low as to lose dignity. What fascinated him most in those gatherings was the music. Minstrels sang of kings and battles, of tragic lovers and distant crusades. Their voices filled the halls, carrying words that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. For a time, Robert could almost forget the constant calculation of status and lose himself in the sound of the lute or the beat of the drum. He began to understand why the wealthy valued entertainment so dearly. It was not merely to pass the time, but to lift the spirit, to remind everyone at the table that life could hold beauty, even amid rivalry and duty. Still, Robert could not ignore the world beyond the castle walls. He sometimes walked, accompanied by guards, through the village that lay on his family's land. He watched peasants bent over their plows, children with faces smeared in dirt, women carrying baskets heavy with grain or firewood. Their lives seemed endlessly hard, and yet they laughed, they sang, they found joy in the smallest things. Puzzled Robert. For all his wealth, he rarely laughed with such abandon. He wondered if perhaps freedom lay not in riches, but in the ability to live without constant scrutiny. At night, when the castle grew quiet, Robert lay beneath woolen blankets, staring at the beams above his bed. He thought of the path ahead, training as a knight, serving his king, perhaps one day inheriting his father's lands. He felt both pride and pressure. To be wealthy in the Middle Ages was to be born already carrying a legacy on your shoulders. He had not chosen it, and yet it shaped every breath of his existence. As Robert approached his 18th year, the world of the castle began to expand beyond its walls. With adolescence behind him, he entered the formal training of knighthood, a process that would define not only his body but his mind, manners, and reputation. Wealth played a central role in this transition. He was provided with armor that weighed heavily upon his shoulders yet shone brilliantly in the sunlight, horses bred for endurance and speed, and weapons meticulously crafted by skilled smiths whose wages reflected the value of every piece. For Robert, wealth meant that he could practice the arts of war and leisure simultaneously, learning swordplay in the morning, studying courtly etiquette in the afternoon, and hunting or riding in the evening. The training itself was rigorous and relentless. Masters of arms drilled him in the techniques of swordsmanship, lance use, and archery. He fell countless times, bruised and exhausted, yet he was reminded constantly that he must persevere. To be rich was to have the resources to learn these skills under the guidance of the best teachers, but it also meant that failure was rarely an option. His family's reputation rested upon his shoulders. A clumsy knight could tarnish generations of honor, and the world of nobility remembered such lapses with whispers that traveled as quickly as rumor through the stone corridors of every manor and castle. Yet, for all the seriousness of knightly training, there were moments of vivid delight. Robert discovered the pleasures of justs and tournaments, where nobles from distant lands brought banners fluttering in the wind, the air filled with the clamor of horns, cheers, and the pounding of hooves. He saw men hurl themselves at each other with lances, the crash of wood and steel echoing across the grounds, and realized that even in competition, appearances mattered as much as victory. Wealth allowed him to participate fully in these spectacles, to commission elaborate armor, to host banquets for spectators, and to invite minstrels to play while the crowds watched. A tournament was both a test of skill and a theater of prestige. Robert's education also included the subtle, intricate arts of diplomacy and influence. He learned how to read letters written in careful script, how to compose messages that flattered without exaggeration, and how to navigate disputes among allies and rivals. Wealth in the medieval world meant control, and control was often exercised through intelligence rather than force alone. He listened carefully to his father's advice, absorbing lessons in negotiation, in the balance of generosity and firmness, and in the delicate exercise of power over both men and land. Every decision, even seemingly minor ones, rippled through the household and beyond, affecting not only the family but the peasants, merchants, and neighboring lords. The household itself continued to be a theater of wealth. Robert began to take more responsibility for managing servants and stewards. Kitchens buzzed with activity. Bakers kneading dough for bread, cooks chopping onions and herbs for savory pies, servants carrying trays of roasted meats and fresh fruit. Robert noticed how the simplest details required constant attention, how the right portion of honey could transform a dish, or how overcooked meat might cause silent disapproval among the guests. Wealth meant abundance, but abundance demanded management, or it could slip away into waste or scandal. Evenings brought music, storytelling, and intellectual pursuits. Robert learned to play the lute, although with modest skill, and to recite poetry that celebrated chivalry, love, and heroism. He began to host gatherings where philosophers, clerics, and visiting nobles discussed matters of law, theology, and strategy. Wealth, in this sense, was more than physical. It was the accumulation of knowledge and cultural refinement. A nobleman's education was meant to make him not only feared or respected, but admired for wisdom and taste. Robert felt both exhilaration and exhaustion at the sheer weight of expectation. Amid these pursuits, he also began to explore the pleasures and curiosities of the outside world. He visited markets in nearby towns, observing merchants selling exotic spices, fine textiles, and rare objects brought from across Europe and the Mediterranean. He tasted sugar for the first time, still an expensive and precious commodity, and marveled at the brilliance of imported fabrics shimmering in the sunlight. The contrast between his life and that of the ordinary townsfolk was stark. While peasants bartered for bread and cheese, Robert could acquire delicacies, silks, and art, all symbols of a life of comfort and privilege. And yet, there were shadows in wealth. Robert witnessed disputes among noble families, some erupting into violence over perceived slights, inheritance, or insults at the table. Alliances were fragile, and even a momentary lapse in judgment could result in duels, fines, or political embarrassment. To be rich in the Middle Ages was to walk a tightrope between abundance and vulnerability, between comfort and danger. He learned that appearances were vital. A generous feast could smooth over tensions, while a poorly chosen word could ignite them. Every gesture, every action, carried weight beyond immediate understanding. Through all of this, Robert's personal life began to intertwine with his public duties. He encountered the formalized courtship rituals of noble society, learning the elaborate gestures of respect, admiration, and subtle flirtation. Courtly love was less about passion and more about performance. The careful offering of compliments, the gift of a scarf or embroidered glove, the delicate navigation of social rules that governed attention and favor. Love, like wealth, required strategy and awareness. He discovered that the heart could be both liberated and constrained within these boundaries, that even the most sincere feelings had to be expressed with tact, lest they disrupt the carefully maintained order of a household and community. Robert's nights often ended in quiet reflection. By candlelight, he would contemplate the responsibilities and pleasures of his life, feeling the pulse of history in the stone walls around him. The tapestry-lined halls, the aroma of roasted meats and herbs, the distant laughter of peasants mingled with the controlled chatter of courtiers. All of it wove together into a rich tapestry of experience. He understood that wealth in the Middle Ages was a double-edged sword. It offered comfort, influence, and opportunities impossible for the common man. Yet it carried invisible chains of expectation, ritual, and unceasing vigilance. As he drifted to sleep beneath heavy blankets, Robert wondered how much of life could ever be free when every movement, word, and thought was measured against the invisible scales of honor, reputation, and legacy. And yet, despite the burdens, he felt a spark of fascination with his world, a desire to explore it fully, to master its codes, and to enjoy, in moderation and with care, the abundance that his birth had granted him as Robert reached the threshold of manhood. The world of leisure, training, and study gradually gave way to responsibility. His father, now aging and confident in his son's skills, began to delegate portions of the estate's management to Robert. He was entrusted with the oversight of fields, villages, and trade, a task that demanded constant attention and subtle judgment. Being wealthy in the Middle Ages was not merely about owning lands. It was about ensuring that the lands produced enough to sustain the household, pay the king's taxes, and support retainers and allies. Failure was not an option, and the weight of this realization pressed upon Robert's shoulders with new intensity. Each morning, he would walk through the manor's grounds, accompanied by stewards who reported the condition of crops, livestock, and workers. He learned the rhythm of sowing and harvest, the subtle differences between wheat and rye, oats and barley. The yield of each field determined the family's prosperity, and yet it was vulnerable to forces beyond anyone's control. Droughts, floods, blights, and even the whims of traders who set prices in distant towns. Robert quickly understood that wealth was as much about foresight and patience as it was about silver or silk. Trade, in particular, fascinated him. He began visiting local markets, not merely as a buyer but as a mediator between peasants and merchants. He observed the delicate dance of negotiation, noticing how a simple exchange of goods involved skill, reputation, and timing. A barrel of wine could be sold for vastly different prices depending on the buyer's mood, the quality of the cork, or even the rumor of a coming famine. Robert marveled at the complexity of these transactions and realized that his family's wealth was dependent not only on land and labor, but also on knowledge of human behavior and economics. The castle's daily life remained a mixture of routine and ceremony. Meals continued to be elaborate affairs, with servants bringing dishes of roasted meats, pies, fresh cheeses, and fruits. Candles flickered against the stone walls as the family dined, minstrels performed, and the aroma of spiced foods filled the hall. Yet now, Robert had a hand in these proceedings, ensuring that the kitchen operated efficiently, that enough food was stored for the winter, and that the household maintained appearances worthy of their status. He learned that being wealthy required constant vigilance, not merely indulgence. Even the placement of salt on the table or the choice of wine for each guest could affect the perception of the household's competence and refinement. Robert also began participating more actively in social and political affairs. He attended councils, witnessed the resolution of disputes between neighboring lords, and learned how to navigate the intricate hierarchies of courtly life. Wealth in the medieval world was inseparable from power. A lord's influence extended through marriage alliances, patronage of artisans, and careful maintenance of reputation. A poorly judged comment or a perceived slight could escalate into conflict. Robert began to understand that wealth came with a persistent tension between opportunity and danger, between comfort and the need for strategic awareness. Amid these duties, he discovered the pleasures of cultural enrichment. Robert became an avid reader of illuminated manuscripts, enchanted by the meticulous hand-painted illustrations and the flowing script that chronicled history, religion, and philosophy. He listened to scholars debate theological and legal questions, feeling a thrill at the depth of knowledge available to those with means. Wealth allowed him access to education, conversation, and literature that the majority of the population could scarcely imagine. Yet he also realized that these privileges were built upon the labor and toil of countless others, from scribes and illuminators to the peasants who harvested the grain that fed the scholars and monks. Hunting trips continued to punctuate his life, offering both sustenance and spectacle. The forests teemed with deer, wild boar, and game birds, and hunts were often grand affairs with dozens of participants, hounds, and hawks. Beyond the thrill of the chase, hunts were social events, occasions for nobles to display prowess, form alliances, and entertain visiting dignitaries. Robert learned the subtleties of these interactions, how a well-timed compliment, a gesture of generosity, or the appearance of skill could strengthen friendships and forge loyalties that might be valuable in times of conflict. Evenings often found him in quiet reflection, walking the castle's corridors or the gardens designed with formal geometry and exotic herbs. These were spaces of serenity amid the constant responsibilities of wealth. Robert contemplated the paradox of his existence. The abundance surrounding him was undeniable, yet every pleasure was shadowed by duty. Every luxury, every tapestry, every ornate cup, every fine garment was secured through labor, strategy, and vigilance. He began to understand that being wealthy in the Middle Ages was less a carefree life than a careful orchestration of resources, reputation, and relationships. Amid these reflections, he also noticed the human elements that wealth could not erase. Servants, stewards, and peasants displayed moments of individuality, an insight that reminded him of the world beyond gold and status. A servant's quiet joke, a peasant's clever solution to a problem in the fields, or the laughter of children chasing chickens across the yard all offered glimpses of life unbound by rigid hierarchy. Robert found himself observing and learning from these interactions, realizing that the richness of experience was not always found in silk or silver, but in human connection and understanding. By the time Robert's father began to speak openly of succession, he was no longer the boy who had marveled at tapestries or wondered at distant markets. He was a young lord in his own right, capable of managing lands, hosting feasts, and navigating the complex web of medieval politics. Yet even as he assumed these roles, he remained aware that wealth was a living, demanding force. It offered comfort, education, and status, but also bound him to responsibilities, scrutiny, and expectations that touched every aspect of life. And so, Robert's journey continued, a blend of pleasure, duty, strategy, and reflection. The comforts of wealth were tempered by vigilance. The abundance of feasts and silks was balanced by labor and oversight. The promise of power was intertwined with the ever-present possibility of conflict. In this way, he lived at the intersection of privilege and responsibility, learning not only what it meant to be rich in the Middle Ages, but also what it meant to carry that richness with awareness, skill, and care. As Robert assumed more authority over his father's lands, the nature of wealth revealed itself in sharper contrast. Gold and silver, tapestries, and exotic spices were delightful, but they were only the visible surface of a far more intricate reality. True power was measured in influence, in the ability to manage people, and in the foresight to protect and grow one's holdings. Robert quickly discovered that responsibility could be unpredictable, even in a world carefully governed by tradition and hierarchy. His first significant challenge arose when a dispute flared between two peasants over the allocation of grazing land. The matter seemed trivial at first, but the potential consequences were immense. If mishandled, the quarrel could escalate into violence or cause a ripple of discontent that might weaken the labor force. Robert summoned both parties and listened carefully. He had learned that justice for the wealthy was as much performance as principle. A fair, decisive resolution demonstrated the Lord's authority while reinforcing trust. In this case, he balanced the needs of the villagers, adjusted grazing schedules, and subtly reminded them of the privileges they enjoyed under his protection. The peasants left with bowed heads but murmurs of approval, and Robert felt a new awareness of the subtle art of governance. Trade posed a different kind of challenge. Local merchants, always attentive to profit, pressed for better deals on grain, livestock, and wool. Robert's family had the wealth to insist upon terms, yet he recognized the importance of diplomacy. A hostile merchant could divert business to a rival estate, undermining revenue streams. He learned to weigh patience against firmness, offering small concessions to maintain loyalty while protecting the estate's interests. The lesson was clear. Wealth in the Middle Ages was not static. It required constant negotiation and strategic thinking to preserve. Beyond the markets and fields, Robert confronted the complexities of noble obligations. Invitations to nearby castles demanded careful planning. Travel was slow, roads were rough, and the dangers of bandits or rival lords loomed. Yet these visits were vital for maintaining alliances, arranging marriages, and cultivating favor. A single misstep, a delayed arrival, a poorly timed compliment, or the wrong choice of gift could tarnish reputation. Robert realized that wealth carried obligations that extended far beyond personal pleasure. It was a web of duties connecting families, estates, and kingdoms. Meanwhile, the castle itself remained a microcosm of human dynamics. Servants vied for favor, stewards managed stores and records, and the cooks experimented with new dishes to impress guests. Robert took a keen interest in these operations, not only for efficiency but also as a means of understanding the people whose labor sustained him. He learned the delicate balance of kindness and authority, discovering that genuine respect and attentiveness often achieved more than strict control. Observing human behavior became an essential skill, as essential as riding, swordsmanship, or managing finances. Amid these duties, Robert's personal life developed layers of complexity. Courtship rituals and alliances occupied both his mind and time. Noblewomen's attention could enhance influence, while missteps could provoke embarrassment or rivalries. Gifts were chosen with care, embroidered gloves, fine perfumes, or delicate jewelry, and each gesture was weighed for its symbolic meaning. Love in this world was inseparable from politics. Affections and alliances intertwined, creating webs of connection that could strengthen or imperil the family's standing. Robert learned patience, observation, and subtlety, realizing that charm and perception were as vital as courage and wealth. At the same time, moments of leisure provided respite from responsibility. Robert continued to ride and hunt, savoring the wind in his face and the thrill of the chase. Music, poetry, and storytelling offered entertainment and reflection, and he began to appreciate the artistry and skill that these forms of expression required. Wealth enabled these experiences, yet it also demanded that they be conducted with dignity. Even pleasure was a stage upon which Robert's status was displayed and observed. Through all these experiences, he developed an appreciation for the broader human tapestry surrounding his life. He observed villagers celebrating harvest festivals, children playing games with sticks and hoops, and neighbors sharing stories in the fading light of evening. These glimpses of everyday joy reminded him that wealth was not the only measure of fulfillment. Human creativity, resilience, and connection existed at every level, from the humblest cottage to the grandest hall. Robert's understanding of wealth deepened. It was not merely gold or land, but the capacity to steward resources, protect lives, and cultivate society. Evenings often concluded with reflection. By candlelight, Robert considered the choices he had made, the responsibilities he had navigated, and the lessons learned. He understood that his family's fortune provided unparalleled opportunity, yet it came with unending obligations. The contrast between abundance and duty, pleasure and vigilance, luxury and labor, became increasingly clear. Wealth, he realized, was not merely a gift but a task, a challenge that required intelligence, empathy, and perseverance. In this stage of life, Robert's days were filled with activity and contemplation alike. The physical pleasures of feasts, fine clothing, and comfortable living intertwined with intellectual challenges, moral decisions, and social diplomacy. Each moment demanded thought, foresight, and care. He came to see that true wealth in the Middle Ages was inseparable from responsibility, that every indulgence bore a subtle cost, and that mastery of one's environment, both human and natural, was as valuable as the richest coin. As he lay down at night, the flickering candlelight casting gentle shadows across the stone walls, Robert understood that he had entered a world where richness was both a blessing and a constant burden. Every choice mattered, every gesture had consequence, and every day offered a lesson in the delicate balance of privilege and responsibility. And yet, amid the endless demands, there remained fascination, curiosity, and the quiet pleasure of knowing that he lived in a world both challenging and extraordinary, a world defined by wealth, power, and the intricate dance of human lives. As Robert settled into the responsibilities of lordship, he began to understand that wealth, though a source of comfort and influence, also painted a target on his back. Rival lords, always attentive to opportunity, watched his lands and alliances carefully, calculating how to gain advantage. A minor dispute over a boundary, a poorly worded letter, or even a delayed payment could escalate into conflict. Robert learned quickly that the privileges of wealth carried an obligation to navigate danger with foresight and tact, and that even a single misstep could undermine years of careful management. One of his first lessons in political intrigue came during a neighboring lord's visit. Lord Henri, a distant relative with ambitions that masked politeness, arrived with a retinue of soldiers and advisors. At first, the meeting seemed ceremonial. The exchange of greetings, the presentation of gifts, the discussion of minor matters of trade and labor. Yet beneath the surface, every phrase was loaded with subtle meaning, every gesture a test of authority. Robert observed Henry's eyes carefully, noting moments of hesitation, concealed impatience, and small signs of challenge. He realized that wealth was not just a resource. It was a language spoken in courtesies, feasts, and the placement of one's seat at the table. Trade negotiations soon followed. Merchants brought reports of goods flowing along distant routes. Silks from Venice, spices from the Levant, furs from the north. Robert's father had always emphasized that knowledge of trade was as valuable as the lands themselves, and Robert now applied this lesson practically. He met with merchants, evaluating prices, quality, and reliability. He learned to anticipate fluctuations in supply and demand, understanding that a single poorly timed decision could affect the prosperity of his estate for months. Wealth was no longer abstract. It required constant vigilance, judgment, and diplomacy. At the same time, family matters demanded attention. Marriages were arranged not merely for affection, but for alliance. Robert's sister's prospective suitor came from a family whose lands bordered their own, promising political support and shared resources. Negotiations included dowries, gifts, and guarantees, each carefully weighed. Robert observed how wealth intertwined with loyalty, expectation, and strategy. He realized that every decision, even within a family, could influence power, security, and reputation. Feasts continued, but their purpose evolved. No longer merely a display of abundance, dinners became opportunities to communicate status, test alliances, and subtly influence opinions. Every dish, every cup of wine, and every gesture carried meaning. Robert learned to smile at compliments, accept praise with modesty, and deflect potential slights with grace. The lessons of etiquette, long drilled in childhood, now revealed their full importance. They were shields and tools, safeguarding the family's honor while projecting power and confidence. Amid these political challenges, Robert also maintained personal interests. Hunting remained a vital practice, providing both sustenance and opportunity for observation. He learned to read the forest, the subtle movements of game, the behavior of birds, even the footprints in the mud, all revealing patterns that could guide strategy. Hunting parties also served as informal councils, where trusted allies exchanged news, rumors, and opinions while sharing the excitement of the chase. Wealth granted access to these experiences, and Robert recognized that every opportunity carried lessons beyond the thrill of sport. Education and culture remained central to his life. He continued to study illuminated manuscripts, practice the lute, and participate in discussions about law, philosophy, and history. The combination of intellectual pursuit and practical responsibility shaped him into a figure whose knowledge enhanced his authority. He understood that wealth in the Middle Ages was not merely material. It was intertwined with skill, wisdom, and the ability to perceive the currents of society and human behavior. Yet even in moments of reflection, Robert could not ignore the human realities surrounding him. Peasants worked tirelessly in the fields. Merchants navigated the risks of travel and commerce, and servants maintained the smooth operation of the household. Their lives, though constrained by circumstance, displayed resourcefulness, resilience, and moments of creativity. Robert came to appreciate that the richness of experience was not found solely in gold or silk, but in the capacity to observe, understand, and respond to the human world. As tensions among neighboring lords simmered, Robert learned to navigate alliances and rivalries carefully. He discovered that diplomacy often required patience, subtlety, and occasional compromise. A demonstration of power could deter aggression, while a well-timed gesture of generosity could foster loyalty. Every decision had consequences, and Robert realized that the management of wealth and influence was a continuous, delicate balancing act. At night, Robert often reflected on the dual nature of his position. Wealth afforded him privilege, education, and opportunity, but it also brought obligation, scrutiny, and the potential for conflict. The comforts of home, the warmth of the hearth, the abundance of food, the safety of stone walls, stood in contrast to the responsibilities that extended far beyond the castle. He understood that being wealthy in the Middle Ages was not merely a gift. It was a lifelong endeavor, requiring intelligence, judgment, and vigilance. Through these experiences, Robert grew into a young lord capable of navigating the complex, interwoven worlds of wealth, duty, and human relationships. He understood that every choice carried weight, that every gesture could influence alliances, and that every moment was an opportunity to strengthen the position and reputation of his family. And in this understanding, he began to grasp the true nature of medieval wealth. It was a living, demanding force, shaping every aspect of life while offering both privilege and peril in equal measure. Robert's understanding of wealth and responsibility was put to the test during a year when misfortune seemed to shadow the land. A poor harvest threatened not only the prosperity of his estate, but also the livelihoods of the peasants who depended upon it. Fields that had once yielded golden waves of wheat now offered sparse, uneven stalks, and the stench of spoiled grain filled the storehouses. The household grew tense, for wealth in the Middle Ages was fragile. Abundance could vanish in a season, and with it came the potential for unrest, debt, and diminished reputation. Robert realized that his role as a lord was not merely ceremonial. It was a safeguard against disaster, a mantle of responsibility that touched every life under his care. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Villagers murmured about insufficient bread, merchants pressed for payment, and rumors spread of hardship in neighboring lands. Robert called a council with his stewards, carefully analyzing the estate's supplies and reserves. He worked to ensure that grain was rationed, that livestock received adequate fodder, and that trade agreements could be renegotiated to stabilize income. Every decision required foresight. Too harsh a ration might incite rebellion, while generosity could deplete stores needed for survival. In this way, wealth demanded calculation, empathy, and vigilance, for even minor misjudgments could ripple outward into catastrophe. Beyond material management, Robert faced social pressures. The peasants, while loyal, were not blind to scarcity. He walked among the village, observing tension in bowed heads and wary glances. Small disputes flared over grazing, access to water, and labor obligations. Robert mediated each with patience, striving to maintain both fairness and authority. He realized that wealth granted the power to protect, yet it also imposed the constant duty to enforce justice. The balance was delicate. The life of a lord required both firmness and subtle persuasion, and each decision influenced not only material prosperity but also trust, morale, and loyalty. During this period, political intrigue intensified. Neighboring lords sensed weakness, subtle tests of Robert's resolve appearing in letters, unsolicited advice, and casual commentary at shared gatherings. He observed that even seemingly trivial remarks carried meaning, revealing ambition, discontent, or opportunism. Wealth in the medieval world was inseparable from reputation. It was both shield and sword, and Robert learned to wield it carefully, aware that miscalculation could invite challenges to his authority. Every interaction, every negotiation, became a test of judgment, diplomacy, and perception. Despite these challenges, Robert continued the pursuits that defined noble life. Hunting trips were no longer only recreation. They provided practical lessons in observation, patience, and strategy. The rhythm of the forest, the behavior of game, and the coordination of hounds all mirrored the coordination required in estate management. Similarly, music, storytelling, and literature offered moments of reflection, sharpening the mind and offering insight into human behavior. Robert recognized that wealth was not merely accumulation of goods, but cultivation of skill, knowledge, and discernment. His personal relationships, too, grew more complex. Arranged marriages and alliances required careful attention. Gifts, gestures, and words were scrutinized for meaning, capable of building loyalty or sowing discord. Robert began to understand the delicate interplay between affection, obligation, and strategy. Wealth enabled influence, but influence demanded tact. Every social interaction was a test of judgment, a stage upon which reputation and authority were constantly enacted. As the months passed, Robert faced the human consequences of misfortune. Villagers struggled, children went hungry, and the elderly were vulnerable. He observed the resilience and ingenuity of those around him, learning from their resourcefulness. Their lives, though constrained, displayed ingenuity, courage, and adaptability, qualities that wealth could neither replace nor buy. Robert came to appreciate that true nobility required attention not only to abundance, but also to human well-being, that wealth without stewardship could quickly transform from privilege into peril. By night, Robert reflected on the lessons of scarcity and power. Candlelight cast flickering shadows on the stone walls as he considered the interconnectedness of wealth, responsibility, and human lives. He realized that abundance was never permanent, that privilege demanded foresight and empathy, and that authority was meaningful only when exercised with wisdom and care. Each crisis, each challenge, deepened his understanding of the responsibilities his inheritance imposed. Through this period, Robert matured in ways wealth alone could not dictate. He learned patience, strategic thinking, and the subtle art of persuasion. He discovered that power and privilege, while offering comfort and opportunity, carried constant demands, requiring both skill and moral attention. Wealth was a living force, shaping every decision, coloring every interaction, and defining both the pleasures and burdens of life. By the time the harvest finally stabilized and the threat of famine receded, Robert had gained a new perspective. He saw the fragility of abundance, the importance of loyalty and justice, and the intricate balance required to maintain wealth and influence. His experience underscored a timeless truth. In the Middle Ages, being rich was not merely about comfort or display. It was a continuous, demanding exercise in foresight, diplomacy, and stewardship, and the most capable lords were those who understood that responsibility was inseparable from privilege. With the immediate crisis of the poor harvest behind him, Robert's attention shifted toward expansion, both of his lands and his influence. The life of a wealthy lord was never static. Possession of resources required constant vigilance, but the strategic use of those resources could enhance power, prestige, and security. Robert now began to look beyond his own estate, seeking opportunities to strengthen alliances, solidify loyalty, and demonstrate the reach of his family's wealth. The first avenue of expansion came through trade. Merchants from distant towns arrived with goods that carried the allure of the exotic. Fine silks dyed in rich indigo and crimson, spices that perfumed the kitchens for weeks, and rare metals that glinted in the torchlight. Robert observed the negotiations closely, learning to recognize the subtle signals that revealed a merchant's intentions. He struck deals that secured favorable prices and reliable delivery, understanding that wealth was as much about foresight and networking as it was about coin. Each successful transaction reinforced his authority and the prosperity of his estate, while mistakes could imperil reputation, profit, and the trust of allies. Hosting grand events became another tool to cement influence. Tournaments, feasts, and ceremonial visits provided occasions to display wealth, skill, and sophistication. Knights from neighboring lands arrived to joust in the sunlit arena, banners fluttering in the wind, horns echoing across the courtyard. Robert watched the clash of lances and swords, noting how strength and honor were carefully observed and recorded in whispers and letters. Each event was a stage upon which his family's status was broadcast to the surrounding region, a delicate combination of spectacle, diplomacy, and strategy. Wealth allowed such displays, but skill and judgment determined their impact. Feasts, in particular, demanded meticulous preparation. Servants labored for hours in the kitchens, roasting meats, baking bread, preparing pies, and arranging fruits in elaborate displays. Minstrels played melodies that floated above the chatter of guests, while jesters performed tricks to amuse the court. Robert supervised the arrangement, timing, and presentation, understanding that even minor missteps, a burnt dish, an incorrectly poured cup, a misplaced seat, could diminish prestige or invite subtle ridicule. In this world, wealth was inseparable from careful management, and the smallest details could carry profound significance. By now, Robert understood the duality of privilege and responsibility. His wealth allowed comfort, access, and opportunity, yet it also imposed constant obligations, scrutiny, and potential hazards. Every interaction, every decision, every event was an opportunity to strengthen influence or risk diminishing it. The life of a wealthy medieval lord was a continuous balancing act between abundance and obligation, spectacle and strategy, leisure and vigilance. Through these experiences, Robert's confidence grew. He began to see himself not merely as an heir or participant, but as an active shaper of his world. He grasped the nuances of diplomacy, trade, and social influence, appreciating that wealth was both a resource and a responsibility, a force that could create stability, command loyalty, and inspire respect, or, if mismanaged, invite disaster. And in this understanding, he glimpsed the essence of life in the medieval upper world, a continuous interplay of fortune, judgment, and human connection, where every action reverberated across the complex web of society. As Robert's influence grew, so did the scrutiny of those around him. A neighboring lord, Sir Alaric, watched the expansion of Robert's estates with a mixture of admiration and envy. What began as casual observation soon became subtle provocation. A dispute over a shared waterway, rumors of encroachment on grazing land, and offhand comments during regional gatherings. Robert recognized the pattern. Wealth in the Middle Ages attracted attention, and not all attention was friendly. He realized that his growing fortune, his display of power through feasts and tournaments, and his ability to manage the land effectively had made him a target for political maneuvering. The first serious encounter occurred during a council meeting convened by the local barons to discuss resource allocations for the coming year. Sir Alaric presented grievances in a calculated manner, highlighting minor mismanagement on Robert's estate and questioning decisions over trade agreements. The room, filled with nobles and advisors, waited for Robert's response. He felt the pressure of observation, aware that any sign of weakness could embolden his rival. Robert had learned from prior experience that diplomacy required a combination of firmness, composure, and subtle intimidation. He responded with precise arguments, referencing trade records, harvest reports, and historical agreements. His calm authority diffused tension, and though Alaric's eyes betrayed dissatisfaction, the council accepted Robert's reasoning. The first round had been won, but Robert knew this was only the beginning. The conflict extended beyond words. Robert began to monitor borderlands, ensuring that resources, livestock, and guards were positioned effectively. Wealth provided the means to secure these areas, but vigilance and planning were equally important. Every patrol, every storehouse, and every interaction with villagers reinforced stability or exposed vulnerability. Robert recognized that abundance was fragile, and that managing wealth required both foresight and preparation against threats, whether natural, economic, or human. Amid this tension, Robert continued to cultivate alliances. Marriages, trade partnerships, and social connections became tools of strategy. He hosted gatherings designed to reinforce loyalty among lesser lords and influential merchants, using feasts and tournaments to display generosity, competence, and power. Wealth allowed these demonstrations, but their success depended on careful orchestration and understanding of human perception. Robert observed gestures, listened to conversations, and noted alliances forming in subtle ways, learning that influence was built as much through observation and patience as through coins or lands. Trade continued to play a vital role. Merchants brought word of shortages in distant regions, opportunities for profit, and the potential for new connections. Robert negotiated carefully, balancing immediate gain with long-term relationships. A single misstep, a poorly chosen contract, delayed payment, or misunderstanding could create enmity that might manifest later in rebellion, conflict, or lost opportunities. He recognized that wealth was not static. It required constant attention, management, and strategic decision-making. Robert's personal responsibilities deepened. Servants and stewards looked to him for guidance. Peasants sought fair judgment, and neighboring nobles gauged his strength through observation. Even leisure, such as hunting and cultural pursuits, became intertwined with strategy. Observing the movements of the hounds, coordinating with fellow hunters, and evaluating the skill of participants in games or competitions all reinforced lessons in timing, foresight, and authority. Wealth enabled these activities, but skill and judgment determined their value. The mounting tension with Sir Alaric also provided insight into human behavior. Robert noticed how envy, ambition, and pride could drive actions that appeared trivial but carried consequences. He realized that the power conferred by wealth demanded attentiveness not only to material assets but also to psychology, reputation, and perception. Every conversation, gesture, and exchange could shift alliances, influence loyalty, or create subtle vulnerabilities. Evenings were spent in reflection. By candlelight, Robert considered the balance between privilege and duty, abundance and vigilance. He recognized that wealth in the Middle Ages was inseparable from responsibility. Every advantage required careful management, every display of power invited scrutiny, and every decision could reverberate across the network of human relations. He understood that to preserve his family's prosperity and influence, he had to navigate not only material and economic challenges but also social, political, and psychological landscapes. Through these experiences, Robert grew more adept in the complex dance of medieval wealth and power. He learned that influence was earned as much through observation, patience, and diplomacy as through resources. He understood that rivalry, tension, and challenge were inherent to privilege, and that the true measure of a lord lay in his ability to maintain stability, command respect, and navigate the intricate web of human ambition. Wealth, Robert realized, was not merely an inheritance of lands or silver. It was a living force, shaping every interaction, guiding every decision, and defining both the pleasures and the responsibilities of his life. As Robert's rivalry with Sir Alaric intensified, he realized that visible displays of strength alone would not ensure security or influence. Wealth, he had learned, was as much about subtlety and perception as it was about coin, land, and armies. He began to employ quieter strategies, sending trusted messengers to gather intelligence, listening for rumors in markets and inns, and observing the interactions of neighboring lords. In this way, he could anticipate threats, understand motives, and act with foresight before open conflict emerged. One evening, a courier arrived bearing a note in delicate handwriting. The message, phrased carefully to conceal both urgency and intent, hinted at a potential alliance between two of Sir Alaric's minor allies. Robert read the words slowly, understanding that even this minor correspondence could influence regional power. He consulted with his stewards and advisors, weighing options, timing, and possible consequences. Wealth provided the means to respond, guards, resources, and strategic gifts, but wisdom dictated how, when, and to whom these tools should be applied. Every decision carried both risk and reward, and Robert knew that the balance was delicate. Espionage became an unexpected necessity. Robert discreetly employed peasants and servants to observe roads, markets, and gatherings, bringing back information about troop movements, shipments, and whispered plans. The practice required subtlety. Suspicion could provoke rebellion, mistakes could expose him, and overzealousness could erode loyalty. In this, he discovered a paradox of medieval wealth. The greater the abundance, the more complex the network of obligations, threats, and responsibilities, and the more essential the ability to manage them intelligently. Meanwhile, secret negotiations unfolded alongside open diplomacy. Robert corresponded with distant nobles, carefully choosing words, gifts, and timing to strengthen alliances. He sent rare spices, fine textiles, and delicately illustrated manuscripts as tokens of goodwill, each gesture calculated to maintain respect and foster cooperation. Wealth allowed these displays, but judgment determined their effectiveness. He understood that influence depended not merely on resources but on perception, timing, and the ability to anticipate others' intentions. In his personal sphere, Robert observed that loyalty was both fragile and essential. Servants, stewards, and retainers provided critical information, support, and labor, yet each individual had motives, ambitions, and perspectives. Maintaining trust required attention, fairness, and occasional generosity. Wealth enabled rewards, comfort, and status, but Robert learned that genuine loyalty could not be purchased. It was cultivated through consistent behavior, judgment, and respect. Hunting and leisure maintained a dual purpose. Organized hunts allowed him to gather allies and observe potential threats in a neutral setting, while also refining his skills in strategy, timing, and coordination. Music, storytelling, and informal gatherings served similar purposes, testing the loyalty, temperament, and judgment of those around him. In these moments, wealth provided the means to orchestrate events, but the lessons derived from them depended on perception, patience, and careful observation. Conflict with Sir Alaric remained a persistent undercurrent. Each minor incident, a disputed boundary, an unsolicited comment, or a slight delay in tribute, was examined for intent and potential leverage. Robert learned that the true power of wealth lay not only in resources but also in the capacity to interpret human behavior, anticipate actions, and act decisively when necessary. Every choice shaped reputation, alliances, and the perception of strength, and any misstep could embolden rivals or erode trust. Evenings provided time for reflection, a candlelit routine of reviewing messages, observing maps, and considering the implications of each interaction. Robert understood that wealth required continuous attention. Every privilege carried the responsibility of stewardship, every luxury demanded vigilance, and every relationship could influence fortune or disaster. The comforts of abundance were inseparable from the obligations that sustained them. Through this careful navigation of intrigue and strategy, Robert's understanding of wealth deepened. He realized that influence was not merely the product of gold, land, or armies, but of observation, foresight, and subtlety. Rivalries, alliances, and loyalty were threads woven through the fabric of power, and only a careful, thoughtful lord could maintain stability amid competing interests. Wealth, he concluded, was a living, dynamic force. It created opportunity, demanded skill, and shaped every aspect of life in the Middle Ages, from grand feasts to whispered rumors, from courtly gestures to the vigilant management of lands and people. The simmering tension with Sir Alaric eventually erupted into a more tangible threat. Reports arrived of a group of mercenaries and discontented peasants gathering along the border of Robert's lands, a mix of opportunists seeking reward and villagers aggrieved by scarcity. Though the numbers were not overwhelming, the potential for disruption was significant. Wealth, Robert realized, could attract both loyalty and danger. His estates were prosperous, but prosperity invited attention from those willing to challenge it. Robert convened his closest advisors and stewards. Maps were spread across the wooden table, banners marking roads, villages, and patrol routes. Every decision had weight. Misplacing a patrol could allow raiders to strike, overreacting could provoke hostility, and failing to negotiate could alienate potential allies. He understood that defense required both tangible force and strategic subtlety. Wealth provided the means, trained retainers, fortified walls, and reserves of food and weapons, but it could not replace foresight or careful planning. Before any confrontation occurred, Robert sent envoys to the discontented villagers, offering relief in the form of grain, livestock, and small gifts of silver. The gesture served multiple purposes: alleviating hardship, reinforcing loyalty, and signaling that rebellion would be unnecessary. It was a subtle exercise of power. Wealth could be deployed to pacify, persuade, or deter. Simultaneously, he ordered discreet patrols along vulnerable roads, ensuring that any potential aggression could be addressed swiftly. As tensions grew, Robert observed the human dimensions of conflict. Mercenaries were motivated by coin, villagers by grievance, and rival nobles by ambition. Wealth influenced each group differently. For some, it was a promise of reward. For others, It was a tool of intimidation or negotiation. Robert navigated these complexities with careful diplomacy, offering incentives, issuing warnings, and maintaining the perception of both strength and fairness. His understanding of wealth had matured. It was not simply a resource, but a dynamic instrument of influence and control. When the first skirmish occurred, it was minor but revealing. A small band of raiders attempted to seize livestock from an outlying farm. Robert's retainers intercepted them, recovering the animals and demonstrating the reach and efficiency of his authority. The incident was managed with minimal bloodshed, yet it sent a clear message. The estate was well defended, and those who challenged it would face swift consequences. Wealth had facilitated preparation, training, and readiness, but intelligence and decisiveness ensured effectiveness. Beyond the immediate danger, Robert continued to cultivate alliances. He invited neighboring lords to hunting parties and feasts, reinforcing relationships while subtly showcasing his ability to maintain security and prosperity. Gifts were carefully selected to communicate respect and loyalty. Finely embroidered fabrics, rare spices, and delicately bound manuscripts. In these gestures, Robert demonstrated that wealth could be leveraged to stabilize influence, foster loyalty, and deter aggression. The experiences of this period illuminated the delicate balance between abundance and responsibility. Protecting wealth required foresight, preparation, and the skill to anticipate threats. Yet heavy-handed enforcement alone could undermine trust and provoke rebellion. Robert realized that wealth, while granting resources, demanded constant attention to human behavior, diplomacy, and perception. Every action carried consequences, every decision shaped reputation, and every demonstration of power was observed and interpreted by others. In quieter moments, Robert reflected on the human cost of prosperity. Villagers who had previously struggled under scarcity now depended on him for survival. Retainers, soldiers, and merchants all relied on his judgment, resources, and protection. Wealth had created opportunity and comfort, yet it had also woven an intricate web of obligations, requiring vigilance, empathy, and discernment. The privileges of the wealthy, he understood, were inseparable from the responsibilities they entailed. By the season's end, the threat had been neutralized, not through violence alone, but through a combination of strategy, diplomacy, and the judicious application of resources. Robert had learned that wealth was not merely possession, but an active force, shaping interactions, decisions, and outcomes across his estate and beyond. Protection of prosperity required careful management, attention to human nature, and the capacity to act decisively when circumstances demanded. In this period of his life, Robert's understanding of medieval wealth reached a new depth. He recognized that riches were not simply an accumulation of land or coin, but a living network of relationships, obligations, and influence. The challenges he faced, rivalry, scarcity, and potential rebellion, demonstrated that the true value of wealth lay not only in its acquisition, but in its careful stewardship and the ability to wield it wisely amid the uncertainties of human behavior and the shifting tides of fortune. After weathering the threat along his borders, Robert turned his attention to consolidation. Wealth, he realized, was most secure when it was reinforced by infrastructure, alliances, and careful management. Roads connecting villages and markets were repaired and improved, allowing smoother transport of goods and faster communication across his estates. Bridges were reinforced, storage barns expanded, and watchtowers strengthened, ensuring that both prosperity and security were visibly and effectively maintained. Each investment demonstrated not only resources but foresight, projecting stability and competence to allies and rivals alike. Trade networks became a priority. Robert sent emissaries to distant towns, negotiating supply routes for grain, timber, cloth, and luxury goods. Spices from the east, furs from the north, and wine from nearby regions flowed more reliably into his household. Merchants were encouraged through fair deals and timely payments, and he learned to anticipate fluctuations in supply and demand, understanding that a shortage in one region could be leveraged to advantage or, conversely, could threaten stability. Wealth in the medieval world required constant attention, not only to what was present, but also to the potential of what might arrive or vanish. Meanwhile, visible displays of power and refinement remained crucial. Robert hosted feasts that combined ceremony with practical diplomacy. Knights and nobles from distant estates attended, watching the efficiency and abundance of his household. Tables groaned under roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and delicately spiced dishes. Minstrels played tunes that echoed through the halls, while jesters performed acrobatics to entertain the gathered court. Each display communicated competence, wealth, and generosity, a reminder that prosperity could be both enjoyed and leveraged. Yet Robert understood that these displays were only effective if accompanied by careful judgment. A misplaced gesture, delayed service, or minor insult could undercut even the most lavish banquet. Cultural pursuits were intertwined with influence. Robert continued to study illuminated manuscripts, engage with scholars, and explore knowledge across philosophy, law, and history. These pursuits were not idle indulgences. They enhanced his judgment, informed strategy, and provided a subtle demonstration of sophistication to visitors and allies. Wealth in the medieval era was inseparable from intellect and discernment, for visible competence reinforced authority, while hidden knowledge guided decisions that protected estates, alliances, and reputation. Social relationships remained complex and strategically significant. Marriage alliances, dowries, and carefully cultivated friendships strengthened his position while reinforcing loyalty. Even leisure activities, such as hunting parties or musical gatherings, served dual purposes: enjoyment and observation. Robert learned to interpret gestures, measure skill, and understand temperament, recognizing that these insights could inform decisions in diplomacy, negotiation, and governance. Wealth provided the means to host, reward, and influence, but understanding of human behavior determined effectiveness. Robert also began investing in the well-being of those under his protection. Villagers received improved housing, more secure storage for harvests, and fairer allocations of land. Skilled artisans were encouraged to settle nearby, enhancing both the economy and the prestige of his estate. The interdependence of wealth, security, and loyalty became increasingly evident. Prosperity required care for both material and human resources. A neglectful lord could see rebellion or inefficiency undermine abundance, while attentive management could magnify influence and stability. With these investments, Robert gained a sense of control over both immediate and long-term prosperity. His estates became more resilient against scarcity, political challenge, and internal unrest. Roads and bridges facilitated commerce, barns and granaries ensured food security, and cultural sophistication projected authority beyond the castle walls. Wealth, he realized, was not passive. It demanded ongoing action, foresight, and judgment, touching every corner of life from trade to defense, ceremony to scholarship. Even in moments of reflection, Robert considered the fragile nature of privilege. Rival lords continued to observe and test boundaries, and natural events, storms, poor harvests, disease, remained unpredictable. Yet by investing resources wisely, maintaining alliances, and attending closely to human behavior, he could mitigate risk and strengthen influence. He understood that wealth was not merely a personal advantage, but a dynamic force that shaped relationships, opportunities, and the perception of power throughout the region. Through these endeavors, Robert became increasingly aware of the interconnectedness of wealth, responsibility, and influence. Every decision, whether repairing a bridge, negotiating a trade deal, or hosting a feast, had ramifications that rippled across his lands and social networks. Wealth was both a shield and a tool, offering security, opportunity, and status, but demanding skill, vigilance, and judgment. Robert's life illustrated the dual nature of medieval privilege. The pleasures of abundance were inseparable from the labor, foresight, and subtlety required to maintain them. With his estates more secure and trade networks flourishing, Robert turned to expanding influence beyond mere material wealth. He understood that true power in the medieval world required a combination of visibility, cultural sophistication, and military readiness. A well-prepared lord could not rely solely on fortifications or coin. Influence depended on perception, alliances, and the ability to act decisively when opportunity or threat arose. One of Robert's first initiatives was cultural patronage. He invited scholars, artists, and musicians to his court, providing them with resources to create manuscripts, paintings, and performances. Illuminated texts, rare musical compositions, and elaborate tapestries became hallmarks of his household. These displays of refinement served a dual purpose: enriching the court's life and projecting prestige to neighboring lords. Wealth enabled such patronage, but careful selection, encouragement, and support ensured that these efforts enhanced reputation and influence rather than simply consuming resources. At the same time, Robert continued to maintain military preparedness. Trained retainers, archers, and mounted knights conducted exercises and patrols, their skill and discipline reflecting the wealth and management of his estate. Military readiness was not an abstract concern. Neighboring lords, rival mercenary bands, and potential internal unrest required vigilance. Robert understood that visible strength discouraged aggression, while strategic planning allowed him to respond effectively when conflict could not be avoided. Wealth facilitated training, arms, and fortifications, but leadership determined their impact. Robert also sought to expand influence through diplomacy. He cultivated relationships with distant nobles, exchanging gifts, letters, and carefully orchestrated visits. These interactions were layered with subtle signals. Rare spices indicated wealth and refinement, manuscripts suggested education and taste, and well-timed gestures conveyed respect and attentiveness. Every exchange was observed, remembered, and analyzed, influencing reputation and loyalty across the region. Wealth granted the ability to participate in this delicate dance, but discernment guided its execution. Within his own estates, Robert continued to invest in infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and watchtowers improved trade, communication, and defense. Grain stores were expanded, livestock managed more efficiently, and artisans encouraged to settle, enhancing both productivity and prestige. Villagers benefited from these improvements, gaining security, resources, and a tangible sense of prosperity. Robert recognized that wealth was interdependent. The fortunes of his estate relied on both material management and human cooperation. Generosity, fairness, and attentiveness reinforced loyalty, while neglect risked rebellion or inefficiency. Hunting and leisure remained integral, blending recreation with observation and strategy. Organized hunts allowed him to evaluate retainers, allies, and potential rivals in informal settings. Music, storytelling, and social gatherings provided similar opportunities, revealing character, temperament, and subtle alliances. Robert realized that every moment of courtly life, whether public or private, could inform decisions about loyalty, strategy, and governance. Wealth provided the stage, but insight determined its lessons. Even as his influence expanded, Robert remained aware of the fragility of privilege. Rival lords watched his successes carefully, seeking opportunity in any misstep. Natural events, poor harvests, harsh winters, or disease could disrupt even the best-laid plans. Robert's growing understanding of medieval wealth encompassed both abundance and vigilance. Resources could be squandered or protected, relationships cultivated or ignored, and reputation built or diminished. Each choice carried tangible consequences. Amid these efforts, Robert reflected on the nature of power and responsibility. Wealth, he realized, was never simply an inheritance or a comfort. It was a tool that shaped human behavior, social structures, and the perception of authority. The ability to deploy resources wisely, maintain loyalty, and navigate rivalries determined not only prosperity but survival. Luxury without strategy could provoke envy and rebellion. Influence without resources could fade into irrelevance. The balance required constant attention, foresight, and discernment. Through cultural patronage, military preparation, and careful diplomacy, Robert continued to consolidate his position. He strengthened alliances, secured the loyalty of his people, and projected prestige across the region. Wealth was both a means and a responsibility. It enabled comfort, opportunity, and influence, yet demanded continuous management, judgment, and attentiveness. Robert's life illustrated the dual nature of medieval privilege, where abundance and obligation were inseparable, and success depended not merely on what one possessed, but on how one wielded it. Despite the stability Robert had established, the life of a medieval lord was never free from hidden dangers. Wealth and influence attracted attention, not only from rivals outside his estate, but also from those within his household. One evening, a trusted steward delivered troubling news. Subtle irregularities in accounts, whispers of discontent among certain servants, and reports that some messages had been altered before reaching Robert. These signs suggested that betrayal, or at least opportunism, could be festering within the very walls he considered secure. Robert approached the situation with caution. In the medieval world, accusations without evidence could devastate reputation and erode loyalty. He began discreetly observing behavior, comparing reports from multiple sources, and speaking in confidence with individuals whose judgment he trusted. Wealth, he realized, provided the means to reward loyalty and investigate treachery, but insight, patience, and discretion were equally essential. A single misstep could undermine his authority or provoke rebellion among those already uneasy. To gather intelligence, Robert relied on subtle observation. Servants, messengers, and minor retainers were watched for inconsistencies. Deliveries made late, exchanges whispered too hurriedly, or unusual questions posed about supplies and movements. Even casual remarks in the hall or gardens could hint at discontent. Robert had learned that wealth and power attracted both flattery and deception, and that vigilance within one's own household was as critical as managing rival lords or external threats. At the same time, Robert maintained visible confidence and routine. Daily inspections of the estate, hunting excursions, and public interactions continued as normal, signaling that the household remained stable and prosperous. Wealth allowed these displays, reinforcing authority and trust among the majority of loyal subjects. Meanwhile, subtle maneuvers ensured that potential conspirators could not act openly without risk. Strategy, discretion, and timing were crucial. The reputation of a lord depended as much on perception as on actual strength. Robert also used his cultural and social influence to discern loyalty. Invitations to feasts, hunting trips, and private audiences provided opportunities to observe behavior, test honesty, and strengthen bonds. Gestures of respect, attentiveness to protocol, and willingness to follow direction revealed fidelity, while impatience, avoidance, or subtle defiance indicated potential trouble. Wealth made these tests possible. The resources to host gatherings, reward service, and maintain an environment of comfort allowed both observation and influence. Amid this vigilance, Robert considered the human factors behind loyalty and betrayal. Ambition, jealousy, and personal grievance could motivate even long-serving retainers. Wealth magnified these tendencies, creating incentives for deception or opportunism. Understanding the psychology of those around him became as important as the management of resources, estates, and armies. The challenges of medieval wealth were not merely material. They were social, political, and deeply human. Through careful investigation, Robert identified inconsistencies in accounts and actions, confirming suspicions that a small faction had been acting to divert resources and undermine authority. Yet he handled the matter discreetly, addressing the perpetrators privately, enforcing restitution, and restoring order without public scandal. In doing so, he reinforced loyalty among the broader household, demonstrated competence, and preserved the prestige associated with his wealth and position. This episode deepened Robert's appreciation for the responsibilities of affluence. Wealth provided opportunity, comfort, and influence, but it also attracted danger from unexpected quarters. Maintaining authority, security, and respect required constant vigilance, discernment, and judgment. The successful management of his household, estates, and alliances depended not only on resources, but also on the ability to navigate subtle human dynamics, anticipate challenges, and respond with both firmness and tact. Evenings were spent reflecting on lessons learned, the fragile line between loyalty and treachery, the necessity of observation, and the importance of discretion. Robert understood that true power required more than armies, gold, or lands. It demanded intelligence, empathy, and subtlety. Wealth was an instrument, but its effectiveness was measured by the wisdom with which it was wielded. Through this period of intrigue, Robert emerged stronger, more perceptive, and more aware of the complexities of authority. He realized that being wealthy in the medieval world was a constant exercise in balance. Managing resources, securing loyalty, maintaining reputation, and preparing for both visible and hidden challenges. His life illustrated that abundance was inseparable from responsibility, and that true success lay in the skillful combination of prudence, judgment, and action. With internal stability restored, Robert turned his attention once more to the growth of wealth through economic ventures. He understood that in the medieval world, influence and prosperity were reinforced by trade, markets, and skilled labor. Land and coin were essential, but the ability to stimulate commerce, cultivate artisans, and attract merchants could multiply both resources and prestige. Wealth, he realized, was not static. It was a living force that required constant cultivation and strategic deployment. Robert began by investing in local markets. He allocated portions of his estate to construct stalls, paved streets, and protected marketplaces where villagers and traveling merchants could trade safely. Grain, livestock, and produce flowed alongside luxury goods. Silks, spices, fine pottery, and delicate glassware. Wealth allowed him to offer incentives, tax reductions, security, and logistical support to attract merchants from distant regions. In doing so, he transformed his holdings into a hub of regional commerce, increasing both revenue and influence. Trade fairs became a focal point of prestige. Twice a year, Robert organized multi-day gatherings where merchants from far-off towns and even foreign regions arrived to display goods. Exotic spices, brightly dyed fabrics, intricately wrought jewelry, and rare manuscripts created spectacles that delighted nobles and commoners alike. These events allowed Robert to demonstrate both wealth and refinement, while also forging alliances, observing competitors, and strengthening loyalty among retainers and neighboring lords. Every detail, from seating arrangements to the quality of food, from entertainment to security, was carefully orchestrated to reflect both prosperity and competence. Artisan guilds became another avenue of expansion. Skilled carpenters, blacksmiths, weavers, and potters were encouraged to settle on his estates, receiving patronage, workspace, and protection. In return, Robert benefited from their craft, as the production of superior goods reinforced his household's prestige and created trade opportunities. Guilds also contributed to the social fabric of his lands, establishing networks of loyalty, shared knowledge, and structured oversight. Wealth enabled these arrangements, but attention and careful management ensured their productivity and stability. Robert recognized that commerce was intertwined with diplomacy and perception. Neighboring lords observed these developments, aware that prosperity could shift the balance of influence. By hosting trade fairs and fostering skilled labor, he subtly projected authority and sophistication, reinforcing his reputation while strengthening his economic foundation. Wealth in the medieval world was not merely possession. It was a tool of influence, capable of shaping relationships, alliances, and public perception. Security remained an integral concern. With increased trade and gatherings, the potential for theft, fraud, or rebellion grew. Robert implemented watch posts, coordinated guards, and maintained patrols to protect markets and fairs. Wealth allowed for these measures, but strategy, timing, and coordination ensured effectiveness. The prosperity of his estates depended not only on resources, but also on vigilance, planning, and the perception of safety and order. Hunting and leisure continued to provide both respite and opportunity. Organized hunts allowed him to engage with nobles and retainers in a controlled environment, observing skills, temperament, and loyalty. Musical performances, storytelling, and private audiences served as subtle tests and instruments of influence, revealing the character and intentions of those around him. Wealth enabled these occasions, but discernment and perception determined their value. Robert also paid attention to the daily lives of his people. Prosperity could only be maintained if villagers were fed, secure, and motivated. He ensured fair distribution of grain, improved storage facilities, and offered training or employment through workshops and guilds. A contented and productive population reinforced both security and wealth, demonstrating that economic power required not only resources but careful stewardship and attentiveness to human needs. By the season's end, Robert's estates had evolved into a vibrant economic center, where trade, craft, and culture intertwined. Wealth had been leveraged to create opportunity, influence, and prestige, but the process demanded constant oversight, judgment, and strategy. Robert understood that abundance brought both privilege and responsibility, and that the management of commerce, labor, and alliances was as crucial as the possession of gold, land, or armies. Through these initiatives, Robert's understanding of medieval wealth deepened further. He realized that true prosperity was not merely material accumulation but the dynamic interaction of commerce, social influence, security, and cultural refinement. Every decision, whether fostering a guild, hosting a fair, or negotiating with a merchant, was an exercise in both strategy and stewardship, reinforcing the interconnected web of wealth, loyalty, and reputation that defined life in the upper medieval world. With the expansion of markets and trade fairs, Robert's wealth and influence reached new heights, yet prosperity often provokes challenge. Reports arrived of rival lords establishing competing markets and fairs in nearby regions, drawing merchants and customers away from his estates. Though these ventures were not overtly hostile, they threatened to siphon both revenue and prestige. Robert recognized that maintaining dominance required vigilance, innovation, and strategic diplomacy. Wealth alone was insufficient. He began by carefully analyzing patterns of trade. Couriers returned with detailed accounts of merchant movements, customer preferences, and the most sought-after goods. With this information, Robert adjusted schedules for fairs, coordinated unique offerings, and promoted rare commodities that neighboring markets could not match. Exotic spices, intricately dyed fabrics, and specialized tools were prioritized, ensuring that traders and buyers had incentives to return to his fairs year after year. Wealth enabled these acquisitions, but foresight and strategic planning determined their effectiveness. Diplomacy played a subtle yet critical role. Robert extended invitations to neighboring lords to participate in joint fairs, offering shared profits or co-hosting privileges. These gestures created networks of interdependence, reducing direct competition while fostering alliances. Wealth provided both the means to reward cooperation and the leverage to negotiate favorable terms. In this way, Robert balanced rivalry with partnership, understanding that the success of commerce depended as much on relationships as on resources. Innovation became another tool for maintaining advantage. Robert commissioned skilled artisans to produce new designs, introduce advanced techniques, and craft unique items for trade. Luxury textiles featured previously unseen patterns. Finely wrought silverware showcased intricate engravings. Woodworking included both utility and elegance. Patrons and buyers marveled at the sophistication of these goods, further reinforcing the reputation of Robert's estates. Wealth enabled experimentation, but creativity, management, and discernment ensured that investments yielded tangible benefits. Robert also considered the human element of competition. Merchants, artisans, and peasants responded to incentives, reputation, and trust as much as to financial gain. By maintaining fair dealings, prompt payment, and consistent oversight, Robert fostered loyalty that rival markets struggled to replicate. Workers and traders became advocates, spreading news of the reliability, security, and abundance offered under his patronage. Wealth facilitated these measures, but integrity, judgment, and careful management amplified their impact. Security remained essential amid increasing activity. The movement of valuable goods, influx of visitors, and occasional tensions among merchants necessitated vigilance. Guards patrolled trade routes and marketplaces, patrols monitored entry points, and watchtowers observed roads and surrounding lands. Wealth funded these protections, but strategic placement and coordination determined their effectiveness. Prosperity could attract envy, crime, or opportunism, and Robert understood that abundance was inseparable from vigilance. Leisure and cultural life reinforced influence. Feasts, tournaments, and performances were aligned with market events, drawing nobles and merchants into social networks while demonstrating both refinement and authority. Observing guests' reactions, alliances, and behavior provided valuable insight, helping Robert gauge loyalty, skill, and temperament. Wealth enabled these gatherings, but judgment and perception determined how effectively they reinforced power and reputation. Even in times of reflection, Robert considered the fragility of advantage. Competitor success could not be ignored. Natural events could disrupt supply chains, and minor errors could erode confidence. Yet by blending innovation, diplomacy, vigilance, and stewardship, he maintained both economic dominance and social influence. Wealth was not merely accumulation, it was a dynamic, living tool that shaped outcomes, relationships, and perceptions. Through these efforts, Robert's understanding of medieval affluence continued to evolve. True prosperity required the strategic interplay of resources, relationships, and perception. Every decision, from commissioning an artisan to negotiating an alliance, carried consequences for influence, reputation, and wealth. Robert's life illustrated that abundance was inseparable from responsibility. The careful management of people, goods, and opportunities was as crucial as possession itself, and the true measure of power lay in the skillful application of all these elements. While commerce, trade fairs, and artisan guilds strengthened his wealth and influence, Robert understood that the perception of virtue and moral authority was equally vital. In the medieval world, lords were not judged solely by their coffers or military might. Reputation, piety, and visible concern for the community were integral to lasting influence. Robert decided to invest in charitable works and religious patronage, recognizing that wealth could be deployed to elevate both status and social cohesion. He began with the construction and restoration of churches and chapels on his estates. Skilled masons, carpenters, and artisans were commissioned to build or repair sacred structures, their craftsmanship reflecting both devotion and refinement. Robert provided funds for ornate stained glass, carved wooden pews, and hand-painted murals depicting biblical scenes. These acts demonstrated piety, supported local religious life, and drew attention from both clergy and visiting nobles. Wealth enabled these projects, but careful oversight ensured quality and long-term impact. Charitable works extended to his population. Poorer villagers received alms, grain during harsh winters, and medical attention when illness struck. Robert established small dispensaries and oversaw distribution with fairness, ensuring that aid reached those in need. By addressing hardship visibly and effectively, he cultivated loyalty, stability, and gratitude. Wealth allowed resources to flow, but judgment, organization, and empathy determined their efficacy. Robert also invested in education, sponsoring tutors for children of artisans, merchants, and minor nobles. Knowledge became a tool of influence. Children trained under his patronage would grow to be loyal, capable, and socially connected. By fostering literacy, numeracy, and practical skills, Robert not only enriched lives but also strengthened his long-term economic and social networks. Wealth facilitated opportunity, but foresight ensured enduring benefit. Religious patronage further enhanced his standing. Robert maintained strong ties with influential clerics, providing endowments for abbeys and monasteries. Monks and priests, in turn, chronicled his deeds, advised on strategy, and lent moral legitimacy to his rule. Pilgrimages and festivals were supported through funds and organization, drawing visitors and attention to his estates. Wealth made this influence tangible, while careful cultivation of relationships and reputation amplified its reach. Simultaneously, Robert remained aware of the need for discretion. Extravagant displays of charity could appear self-serving, while neglect could erode loyalty or invite criticism. He learned to balance visibility with subtlety, ensuring that acts of generosity were meaningful, strategic, and reinforcing of both authority and moral standing. Wealth was most powerful when deployed thoughtfully, creating networks of gratitude, obligation, and perception that strengthened governance and prestige. Festivals and religious celebrations became stages for subtle diplomacy. Noble visitors were observed for character, alliances tested through games and contests, and discussions conducted in informal settings to gauge loyalty or intentions. Wealth funded these gatherings. Food, entertainment, accommodations. But the lessons derived from observation, interaction, and judgment were priceless. Robert realized that influence depended as much on perception and social acumen as on coin, land, or armies. Even routine governance reflected his dual focus on prosperity and morality. Tax collection was conducted with fairness. Disputes were arbitrated judiciously. Labor assignments were monitored for equity. Prosperity, he understood, depended on the trust and cooperation of those under his care. Wealth provided the tools, resources, personnel, and infrastructure, but leadership and discernment determined the long-term stability and growth of his estates. By the season's end, Robert's integration of charity, religious patronage, and social initiatives enhanced both reputation and loyalty. His estates were not merely prosperous, but respected, admired, and stable. Wealth had been leveraged not only to accumulate resources but to shape perception, morality, and social cohesion. Robert's understanding of medieval power deepened. True influence was a combination of abundance, foresight, moral authority, and strategic deployment of resources. Through these initiatives, Robert continued to embody the dual nature of medieval wealth, the ability to enjoy comfort and opportunity, while simultaneously managing obligations, relationships, and public perception. Prosperity and virtue were intertwined. Luxury and piety reinforced one another, creating a stable, influential, and resilient realm under his guidance. Robert's growing wealth and influence inevitably drew attention from neighboring lords, some of whom viewed his prosperity as a threat or an opportunity. One morning, messengers arrived from Lord Bertrand, a distant yet ambitious noble, requesting a private audience. The tone of the message was courteous but firm, hinting at potential dispute over trade routes and shared lands. Robert understood immediately that diplomacy, strategy, and careful use of resources would be critical to resolve the matter without conflict. Preparations began at once. Robert consulted with advisors, reviewed maps, and gathered intelligence about Bertrand's holdings, trade patterns, and alliances. He considered what his own wealth could leverage: trade concessions, gifts, military support, or shared economic ventures. Every move required foresight. A miscalculation could provoke hostility, while misjudging Bertrand's intentions could diminish influence. Wealth provided options, but insight determined which tools would be most effective. When Bertrand arrived, Robert greeted him with a blend of courtesy and subtle authority. The hall was arranged to display both comfort and competence. Tapestries depicted past victories and prosperous harvests. Tables held fine food and drink, and retainers moved with quiet efficiency. These details were not mere decoration. They were instruments of influence, demonstrating the resources, stability, and refinement Robert commanded. Wealth created the stage. Judgment and perception ensured its impact. The discussion was delicate. Bertrand pressed claims on lucrative trade routes, subtly suggesting that Robert's expansion might be encroaching on his territory. Robert responded calmly, proposing shared access to markets and the rotation of trade fairs to prevent conflict. Offers of joint ventures in artisan production and rare goods created mutual benefit, aligning interests and reinforcing interdependence. Wealth enabled concessions and incentives, but tact and strategic planning shaped outcomes. Subtle negotiation tactics played a key role. Robert allowed Bertrand to speak first, framing agreements as collaborative rather than competitive. He highlighted the advantages of cooperation: increased profits, reduced risk, and strengthened reputations. Small gestures, gifts of finely embroidered cloth, rare spices, or a particularly ornate manuscript, reinforced goodwill, signaling respect and generosity without compromising authority. Wealth acted as currency in both literal and social terms, facilitating negotiation and fostering loyalty. Observation and perception guided every step. Robert noted Bertrand's reactions to proposals, his attentiveness to detail, and subtle body language. Was he sincere, cautious, or opportunistic? Could he be trusted to honor agreements, or did vigilance require safeguards? Wealth alone could not answer these questions. Strategic insight, patience, and subtle analysis were necessary to protect estates, reputation, and influence. By the conclusion of the meeting, a mutually beneficial agreement emerged. Trade routes were shared, markets coordinated, and artisan ventures expanded collaboratively. Bertrand left satisfied, feeling that his own interests had been acknowledged and advanced, while Robert maintained both authority and advantage. Wealth had facilitated tangible incentives, but diplomacy, perception, and strategic planning ensured that influence was preserved and rivalries transformed into productive alliances. In the aftermath, Robert reflected on the lessons of negotiation. Wealth was not simply possession. It was a tool to shape relationships, secure agreements, and influence outcomes without resorting to conflict. Power, he realized, was most secure when reinforced by perception, fairness, and subtle persuasion, as much as by armies or fortifications. Influence depended on the skillful combination of resources, judgment, and foresight. The experience also highlighted the interconnectedness of medieval society. Alliances, trade, and reputation formed a delicate network, where wealth could enhance stability or provoke jealousy, depending on how it was managed. Robert understood that every display of prosperity, every gift, and every agreement had consequences that rippled across both local and regional spheres. True authority required awareness of both material and social currents. Through this diplomatic episode, Robert solidified his position, demonstrating that wealth and judgment together created enduring influence. The ability to negotiate, protect assets, and maintain prestige was as important as the accumulation of resources. The medieval world rewarded those who combined abundance with insight, and Robert's careful orchestration of diplomacy, strategy, and visible authority exemplified the complex, multifaceted nature of privilege in his ERAS winter approached. Robert faced a challenge that no negotiation, market, or alliance could fully prepare him for: the unforgiving forces of nature. Early snowfalls blanketed the landscape, and temperatures dropped sharply, threatening both the harvest stored in barns and the daily lives of villagers, retainers, and traders. Wealth, he knew, could provide tools and provisions, but careful planning and vigilance would determine whether prosperity survived the season intact. Robert began by inspecting storage facilities. Granaries were checked for leaks, pests, and rot. Provisions were counted, rationed, and strategically allocated. Wells and water supplies were secured against freezing, and livestock were sheltered with supplemental feed. Wealth allowed him to hire extra labor, purchase additional supplies, and fortify barns, but strategy dictated timing, prioritization, and the distribution of resources. A single miscalculation could spark famine, disease, or unrest. Villagers and retainers were organized into teams to maintain roads, clear snow from trade routes, and ensure the safety of travelers. Winter travel could be perilous, and merchants relied on secure passage to deliver goods to fairs and markets. Robert provided incentives, rewards, and oversight, reinforcing both loyalty and efficiency. Wealth enabled resources to be deployed quickly, but coordination, leadership, and foresight ensured their effectiveness in extreme conditions. Food preparation and rationing became an intricate task. Daily meals had to sustain energy and morale while preserving limited supplies. He instructed cooks to use preserved meats, dried fruits, root vegetables, and grains efficiently, supplementing with herbs and spices to maintain taste and health. Winter feasts became rare but strategic opportunities to maintain morale, reward service, and demonstrate that abundance could endure even in hardship. Wealth allowed variety and quality, but careful planning ensured sustainability. Hunting continued, though more cautiously. Game was scarcer and snow limited mobility, yet Robert organized small hunting parties to supplement food supplies and maintain the skills and morale of retainers. These expeditions also served as opportunities for observation. Loyalty, judgment, and resilience could be gauged under the stress of harsh conditions. Wealth provided equipment and support, but leadership determined the outcomes. Trade and markets faced disruption. Merchants could travel less frequently, and some distant suppliers risked delayed shipments. Robert mitigated these challenges by maintaining reserve stores, arranging local production, and negotiating temporary agreements with neighboring lords to share surplus resources. Wealth allowed flexibility, but negotiation, foresight, and strategic alliances ensured continued prosperity despite environmental adversity. The harsh winter also revealed the human dimension of wealth and responsibility. Illnesses spread more easily, fires in poorly heated homes became hazards, and the strain of cold tested patience and loyalty. Robert provided medical assistance, organized safe heating solutions, and ensured equitable distribution of firewood and provisions. Wealth enabled resources to flow, but care, empathy, and vigilance preserved both morale and social cohesion. Even within the castle, life required adaptation. Courtyards were cleared, stables heated, and daily routines adjusted to maintain productivity and comfort. Retainers were tasked with monitoring essential operations. Guards remained vigilant, workshops continued to function, and administrative work proceeded without interruption. Wealth facilitated equipment, labor, and supplies, but organization and leadership ensured that operations endured despite the winter's severity. By midwinter, Robert's estates had endured with minimal disruption. The careful deployment of resources, attention to human needs, and strategic foresight reinforced both loyalty and stability. Wealth had provided the tools to survive, but judgment, planning, and leadership had turned potential disaster into a demonstration of competence and resilience. This experience reinforced a profound lesson. Medieval prosperity was never guaranteed. It demanded constant attention, preparation, and skillful management of both material and human resources. Through this trial, Robert's understanding of wealth deepened further. True influence depended not only on accumulation, trade, or alliances, but on the ability to sustain prosperity through adversity, protect dependence, and demonstrate competence under pressure. The winter was a reminder that abundance was fragile, and that survival, stability, and reputation were as critical to power as gold, land, or armies.